Do you worry about some of the concerns of bots being present on social networks? More and more human-like bots that are not necessarily trying to do a good thing, or they might be explicitly trying to do a bad thing, like phishing scams,
Yeah.
like social engineering, all that kind of stuff, which has always been a very difficult problem for
Yeah.
social networks, but now it's becoming almost a more and more difficult problem.
Well, I think that there's a few different parts of this. So one is there are all these harms that we need to basically fight against and prevent. And that's been, a lot of our focus over the last 5 or 7 years is basically ramping up very sophisticated AI systems, not generative AI systems, more kind of classical AI systems, to be able to categorize and classify and identify. Okay, this post looks like it's promoting terrorism. This one is, like exploiting children. This one is looks like it might be trying to incite violence. This one's an intellectual property violation. So there's like it's like 18 different categories of violating kind of harmful content that we've had to build specific systems to be able to track. And
Yeah.
I think it's certainly the case that advances in generative AI will test those. But at least so far, it's been the case, and I'm optimistic that it will continue to be the case, that we will be able to bring more computing power to bear to have even stronger AIs that can help defend against those things. So we've had to deal with some adversarial issues before, right? For some things like hate speech, it's like people aren't generally getting a lot more sophisticated. Like the average person, who, let's say, if someone's saying some kind of racist thing, right? It's like they're not necessarily getting more sophisticated at being racist, right? It's okay. So that the system can just find. But then there's other adversaries who actually are very sophisticated, like nation states doing things. And, we find, whether it's Russia or, just different countries that are basically standing up these networks of bots or inauthentic accounts is what we call them, because they're not necessarily bots. That some of them could actually be real people who are kind of masquerading as other people, but they're acting in a coordinated way. And some of that behavior has gotten very sophisticated and it's very adversarial. So they, each iteration, every time we find something and stop them, they kind of evolve their behavior. They don't just pack up their bags and go home and say, okay, we're not going to try. At some point they might decide doing it on Meta's services is not worth it. They'll go do it on someone else if it's easier to do it in another place. But we have a fair amount of experience dealing with even those kind of adversarial attacks where they just keep on getting better and better. And I do think that as long as we can keep on putting more compute power against it, and if we're kind of one of the leaders in developing some of these AI models, I'm quite optimistic that we're going to be able to keep on pushing against the kind of normal categories of harm that you talk about: fraud, scams, spam, IP violations, things like that.
What about like creating narratives and controversy? To me, it's kind of amazing how a small collection of what did you say, inauthentic accounts? So it could be bots, but
I mean, we have sort of this funny name for it, but we call it coordinated inauthentic behavior.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible how a small collection of folks can create narratives, create stories. Especially if they're viral. So especially if they have an element that can catalyze the virality of the narrative.
Yeah, and I think there the question is you have to be, I think, very specific about what is bad about it, right? Because I think a set of people coming together or organically bouncing ideas off of each other and a narrative comes out of that is not necessarily a bad thing by itself if it's kind of authentic and organic. Mm-hmm. That's like a lot of what happens and how culture gets created and how art gets created and a lot of good stuff. So that's why we've kind of focused on this sense of coordinated inauthentic behavior. So it's like if you have a network of, whether it's bots, some people masquerading as different accounts, but you have kind of someone pulling the strings behind it, and trying to kind of act as if this is a more organic set of behavior, but really it's not. It's just like one coordinated thing. That seems problematic to me, right? I mean, I don't think people should be able to have coordinated networks and not disclose it as such.
Mhm.
Um, but that again, we've been able to deploy pretty sophisticated AI and counterterrorism groups and things like that to be able to identify a fair number of these coordinated and authentic networks of accounts and take them down. And we continue to do that, and I think we've it's one thing that if you told me 20 years ago, it's like, all right, you're starting this website to help people connect at a college, and in the future you're going to be part of your organization is going to be a counterterrorism organization with AI to find coordinated and authentic. I would have thought that was pretty wild, but it's
There's
but no,
a-
I think that's part of where we are. But look, I think that these questions that you're pushing on now, this is actually where I'd guess most of the challenge around AI will be for the foreseeable future. I think that there's a lot of debate around things like, is this going to create existential risk to humanity?
Mhm.
And I think that those are very hard things to disprove one way or another. My own intuition is that the point at which we become close to superintelligence is it's just really unclear to me that the current technology is gonna get there without another set of significant advances. But that doesn't mean that there's no danger. I think the danger is basically amplifying the kind of known set of harms that people or sets of accounts can do, and we just need to make sure that we really focus um, on basically doing that as well as possible. So that's definitely a big focus for me.
Well, you can basically use large language models as an assistant of how to cause harm on social networks. So you can ask it a question. Um, Meta has very impressive, coordinated, inauthentic account fighting capabilities. How do I do the coordinated, authentic account creation where Meta doesn't detect it? Like literally ask that question, and basically there's this kind
Yeah.
of part of it. I mean, that's what OpenAI showed that they're concerned with those questions. Perhaps you can comment on your approach to it. How to do a kind of moderation on the output of those models, that it can't be used to help you coordinate harm in all the full definition of what the harm means.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the fine tuning and the alignment training that we do is basically, when we ship AIs across our products, a lot of what we're trying to make sure is that if you can't ask it to help you commit a crime, right? It's uh so I think training it to kind of understand that, and it's not like any of these systems are ever going to be 100% perfect, but just making it so that this isn't an easier way to go about doing something bad than the next best alternative, right? I mean, people still have Google, right? You still have search engines, so
Mhm.
the information is out there, and for these, what we see is like for nation states or these actors that are trying to pull off these large, coordinated and authentic networks to kind of influence different things. At some point when we would just make it very difficult, they do just try to use other services instead, right? It's just like, if you can make it more expensive for them to do it on your service, then kind of people go elsewhere. And I think that's the bar, right? It's like, it's not like, okay, are you ever going to be perfect at finding every adversary who tries to attack you? I mean, you try to get as close to that as possible, but I think really, kind of economically, what you're just trying to do is make it so that it's just inefficient for them to go after that.
But there's also complicated questions of what is and isn't harm, what is and isn't misinformation. So this
Absolutely.
is one of the things that Wikipedia has also tried to face.
Yeah.
I remember asking GPT about whether the virus leaked from a lab or not, and the answer provided was a very nuanced one and a well-cited one, almost dare I say, well thought out one, balanced. I would hate for that nuance to be lost through the process of moderation. Wikipedia does a good job on that particular thing too. But from pressures from governments and institutions, you could see some of that nuance and depth of information, facts, and wisdom be lost.
Absolutely.
And that's a scary thing. Some of the magic, some of the edges, the rough edges might be lost in the process of moderation of AI systems. So how do you get that right?
I really agree with what you're pushing on. I mean, the core, I think the core shape of the problem is that there are some harms that I think everyone agrees are bad, right? So, you know, sexual exploitation of children, right? Like, you're not going to get many people who think that that type of thing should be allowed on any service, right? And that's something that we face and try to push off the, as much as possible today. Terrorism, um, inciting violence, right? It's like we went through a bunch of these types of harms before. Um, but then I do think that you get to a set of harms where there is more social debate around it.
Mhm.
So misinformation, I think, um, has been a really tricky one because there are things that are kind of obviously false, right? That are maybe factual, um, but may not be harmful. So it's like, all right, are you going to censor someone for just being wrong? It's, if there's no kind of harm implication of what they're doing, I think there's a bunch of real kind of issues and challenges there. But then I think that there are other places where it is, just take some of the stuff around COVID earlier on in the pandemic, where um, there were, real health implications, but there hadn't been time to fully vet a bunch of the scientific assumptions. And, unfortunately, I think a lot of the kind of establishment on that, kind of waffled on a bunch of facts and, asked for a bunch of things to be censored that in retrospect ended up being, more debatable or true. And that stuff is really tough, right? And really undermines trust in that. And um, so I do think that the questions around how to manage that are very nuanced. The way that I try to think about it is that it goes. I think it's best to generally boil things down to the harms that people agree on. So when you think about, is something misinformation or not? I think often the more salient bit is this going to potentially lead to physical harm for someone, um, and kind of think about it in that sense. And then beyond that, I think people just have different preferences on how they want things to be flagged for them. I think a bunch of people would prefer to kind of have a flag on something that says, "Hey, a fact checker thinks that this might be false." Or I think Twitter's community notes implementation is quite good on this. But again, it's the same type of thing. It's like just kind of discretionarily adding a flag because it makes the user experience better.
Mhm.
But it's not trying to take down the information or not. I think that you want to reserve the kind of censorship of content to things that are of known categories that people generally agree are bad.
Yeah, but there's so many things, especially with the pandemic, but there's other topics where there's just deep disagreement fueled by politics about what is and isn't harmful. There's even
Yeah.
just the degree to which
Yeah.
the virus is harmful and the degree to which the vaccines that respond to the virus are harmful. There's almost like a political divide around that. And so how do you make decisions about that where half the country in the United States or some large fraction of the world has very different views from another part of the world? Is there a
I mean,
way
it's
for
really
Meta to
it's really
stay out
tricky.
of
I mean,
the moderation of this?
I think it's very difficult to just abstain, but I think we should be clear about which of these things are actual safety concerns and which ones are a matter of preference in terms of how people want information flagged. Right. So we did recently introduce something that allows people to have fact checking not affect the distribution of what shows up in their product. So okay, a bunch of people don't trust who the fact checkers are. All right, well you can turn that off if you want. But if the content violates some policy like it's inciting violence or something like that, it's still not going to be allowed. So I think that you want to honor people's preferences on that as much as possible. Um, but look, I mean, this is really difficult stuff. I think it's really hard to know where to draw the line on what is fact and what is opinion, because the nature of science is that nothing is ever 100% known for certain. You can disprove certain things, but you're constantly testing new hypotheses and scrutinizing frameworks that have been long held, and every once in a while you throw out something that was working for a very long period of time, and it's very difficult. But I think that just because it's very hard and just because they're edge cases doesn't mean that you should not try to give people what they're looking for as well.